Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I wanted to give you guys a complete guide to making titles inside of DaVinci Resolve 16. So first we're going to talk about some of the default titles that you'll see over in the effects library and go through some of the settings you can customize by default without putting too much extra effort in. And then we're going to jump over to the Fusion tab, which allows you to create your own 3D titles and many other special effects by using nodes linked together in order to generate the title that you may have in mind by using a combination of 3D text, shapes, lighting, and so on. So as you probably saw, you can access the titles that are built into Resolve 16. In the top left-hand corner, the effects library is up there. It'll pop open this menu where under the toolbox you go into titles. And then you're going to see three sections that at the top you have titles, which are more for the classic default titles. Below that, you'll have Fusion titles, and then at the bottom you have subtitles for when you want to add in text that refers to whatever's being spoken in the video at that time. Now, all of the titles except for subtitles actually go onto their own video track. So you would have a title hovering over the video, and you would combine the two layers for your final video output. So you would usually have your base video, whatever you recorded outside, as your video track 1, and then above that you put the titles. Because the titles will be partially transparent, so they let anything below it on the lower layers show through. You don't want to do it the other way around, because if you have a standard video, that actually covers everything and there's no transparency, so you wouldn't be able to see the title. So for that reason, titles almost always go on video track 2 or above. And then subtitles are their own special case. They actually go on a completely separate subtitle track, which once you export the video, would be able to be toggled on or off. Just like if you watch a video on YouTube, you can actually turn on closed captions. That would actually be where the subtitles end up. You would upload it as a SRT subtitle file. For the regular titles, there's really only two categories here. There are the 2D titles, which you will see indicated by the letter T with the underscore under it. And then you have the Fusion titles. So when it's a Fusion title, it's actually a 3D effect generated by a combination of nodes over in the Fusion tab. So anytime you see a title in Resolve that has the lightning bolt symbol for Fusion, then you know that that's a 3D effect that can be edited and manipulated in 3D space. However, there's a downside to using Fusion titles, which is that as 3D effects, they take more computer resources in order to generate. So on weaker machines, you may actually want to just stick to a standard text title, especially if there's no need for it to be 3D because it doesn't need to rotate or anything in 3D space. Then you can just use a standard text title, which will be easier for your computer to render and export. But if you need to be fancier, then that's where Fusion titles or custom Fusion titles come into play. So let's start with the basic non-3D titles, then move into the pre-made Fusion titles. And after that, we'll work on generating 1 or 2 Fusion titles from scratch. And maybe at the end, we'll add in subtitles just to make this more complete. So let's drag the text title into the timeline. So this is as basic as you can get. You can see that when we drop it into video track 2 and our timeline cursor is hovered somewhere where that title exists, it just sits in the middle of the screen using whatever font we set. We can click on the title if we want to edit anything in the inspector. So open the inspector window if you don't have that open right there. And you can see that the settings for these titles is quite simple. You have the basic rich text settings at the top, drop shadow as an option, stroke, which is where you put a color as a border around the outside, and then background, if you want there to be a square box or a box with some curves, hovering in the background behind the title. And that's really all the settings for basic titles. So with any title, you'll see a editable text box where you can put in what the title should be. So we can take this default title and delete everything inside of it and rename it something like Our Trip to the Big City. Now, you don't have to fit everything on one line. If you want to manually put in a new line, just find the breakpoint where you want to set, such as on after the third word there, and then hit enter. And as you add a new line here, the text on the screen will reflect. Also note that any spaces you add will also be reflected there as well. So you can delete a space and then everything will be recentered by default. So you can delete the space and that will affect the alignment of your title. Now you can see here that the alignment is by default left aligned, so that means that everything aligns on the left anchor, which you can imagine as like a vertical line that goes from top to bottom, and everything will start at that vertical line and then go to the right. If you change the alignment to middle alignment, that's going to mean that it equally distributes the text to the left and to the right of a said invisible line, Right alignment, as you can imagine, is going to have all of the text aligned to the right side, making sure that it lines up on that point, not caring about the left. Just like with any standard word processing application like Microsoft Word or LibreOffice, you have access to change the text in much of the same way. So font family, if you want to select a custom font, which you very commonly will, you bring up the list and you grab any font you have installed on your computer. So for instance, I'm a big fan of the Babus Neue font. It's very good for titles because it's big and blocky and clear, easy to read. So I can change it to that. You can increase or decrease the font size until it's as big as you need it to be. Font face, if you want to make it normal or italic or bold italic. Down here towards the bottom, you can see position X, Y, and zoom X, Y. So with zoom, you can kind of increase or decrease the size of your title, but one of the big differences is that you can see that it is keyframeable over here on the right. So what I would recommend you do with a basic title is that you set the size of the title to be where you want it at its full size, and then you can use the zoom with keyframing in order to increase or decrease the size at the intro or ending of your title sequence. So even though it's a basic 2D title, you can still animate it a little bit. So for instance, if I go somewhere into the title where I want the zoom in to be complete, I can click on the keyframing diamond so that at that point in time, it will be at its 1.0 zoom. But then I can go to a lower point, such as at the first frame of that title in the timeline, and then change the zoom to a much lower number. It can only go down to 0.25 at most, but between those 2 points, it will now animate. So doing that will create a simple zoom in effect that doesn't take any time at all, really, for DaVinci Resolve to go ahead and render. In the same way, you can adjust the position. So if I take the keyframing of the zoom and hit right to go to the ending keyframe of that intro animation, so now we're on the right frame in the timeline, I can also keyframe the position so that that's set where it should be in the center of the screen by default. And then I can go to the first frame again, and I could say move it off screen somewhere to the left and then down as well. I'll move it on a little bit there so I can see where I'm positioning the Y. And let's just move this a little bit more to the left. And now what will happen is that it will zoom in and the position will change until it's in the center of the screen. So let's play it back there. Not the most flashy effect, but something that's really easy to work with and renders pretty much instantly. So with drop shadow, you can see that it is enabled by default, but you cannot see it because the offset is set right on top of the text. So in order for a drop shadow to show up, you have to give it some offset. So I could push it like 10 pixels to the right, and then you have a right leaning drop shadow. You can give it a negative Y value, which will aim it down as well. So then you have drop shadow that goes to the right and down, which is probably the most common direction you'd go for drop shadow. You can reverse that if you want to, if it makes more sense. These values can also be animated over time. So if we go back to the ending keyframe there for the zoom in the position animation, I can keyframe the offset of the drop shadow there, go to the first frame, and then maybe there I can set the drop shadow to 0, 0 and see how that looks. So now that drop shadow value will be animating over time. So as it gets bigger into the screen, the drop shadow becomes more apparent going to the left. We could also push it way to the left as it's coming in. So a negative 36 pixel drop shadow could look something a little weird like that. We'll set it back to 0 for now. The idea is that anything with a keyframing diamond you can animate over time, which allows you to create a lot of interesting effects without even relying on 3D fusion nodes. So stroke is kind of the same way. Even though it's enabled by default, it has no size, so you can't see it. So if you start to add a size, that actually allows you to see the stroke, because now it has a 4 pixel stroke around the border of every single letter there. You can also change the color if you want. So we could change that to something like red if we wanted, though I would say black is usually going to look a little bit better. So likewise with the background, it has a default height of 0, which means it's not going to show up at all. So if you want any kind of background, you're going to need to increase the height. So we can expand that to appear there. Just like with anything else that can be keyframed, we can set a keyframe for the height there, go back to the first frame, and maybe initially it has a height of 0, but it increases to that 0.713 height over the couple seconds that the title is fading in. So now it could look like this, which looks a bit weird. So what I'd probably do is remove the keyframe at the start, and instead I will animate it more or less when it has already came in. So I'll set a 0 value keyframe here for the height just a couple frames before it's actually came in. So now it'll look more like this, where the background very quickly fades in. But that looks a little too quick for me, so I'll actually have it finish a few frames after the title makes it to the center of the screen. So I'll set that keyframe there. I'll hit back to go to the original finished keyframe, and I'll click on the keyframe there to remove it. And now there's only 2 keyframes for it to go between. By the way, if you ever want to see these keyframes on a timeline, then with your clip or your title, you can click on the little keyframe button in the bottom right in the timeline, and you can actually see where those keyframes are positioned relative to their time. So that's very useful, especially if you keyframe a lot of different properties for animation. So let's play it back one more time here. So it reaches the center and then the background fades in. Maybe we lower the opacity on the background a little bit so it's less intrusive. You can also see that you can outline the background as well with this outline width setting and give a color to both background or the outline width if you desire. And over on the video tab of a standard text title, you have access to the same properties that you can animate for any normal video clip in DaVinci Resolve. So if you wanted to do something like lower the opacity of the entire title or set a color composite mode, then those kind of settings are available to you. But usually I find that for things like zoom and position, it gets less messy if you actually edit those properties on the text title rather than relying on the video properties for them. But for other properties like doing a 2D rotation without a 3D Fusion title, you would need to come over here for the video setting and set some keyframing for rotation there. Okay, so I'm going to move that out of the way for right now. And let's quickly just go through these default titles and then start talking about Fusion titles. So a scroll title will automatically animate over time, showing all of the lines that you put in the text box. I believe that the speed automatically adjusts so that it can show all of the text titles on screen in the time for the entire scroll animation. So if I go here and add in some lines, clearly it would take a few seconds to go through all of that. So now if we go back to the first frame of that section and hit space, you can see that it speeds up a little bit to make sure that it can show everything in the time allotted. So that would be useful if you were doing a very simple end credits sequence for your video. Not too much else to say about that. You can also see that there is L lower third, M lower third, and R lower third titles. When you put these onto the track, they're basically the same thing. You can see that they have 2 sections for them, a top title and a bottom title, which you can customize individually for things like the size of those elements. And then the left lower third and the right lower third are exactly the same, just that, well, obviously the left lower third is going to be on the left and the right lower third is going to be on the right. So next, let's take a different video clip and start talking about the default Fusion titles that exist in Resolve 16. So the basic one is Text Plus. This is a Fusion title that actually has nothing on it. So we drag it into the timeline. You can see that it just has a basic title showing on screen. The advantage over using this to a regular text title is that there are a bunch of extra tabs here that have settings that you can use to manipulate this title. So as a Fusion title, some things are going to work a little differently. For instance, if you want to add drop shadow to this title, or you want to stroke the outline, you actually need to go over to the 4th tab in the Fusion template here, where it says shading. So in shading, they have some default elements which you can enable, such as element 3 for doing a black shadow or a drop shadow. So if we enable that, you'll see that we get a bunch more settings for the drop shadow. And I would also add that it has considerably more customizability than the old basic titles. But just at a basic level, we could go down to the bottom where we have softness if we want to remove some of the blurriness here. And we can lower the XY softness if we want. And when we do that, you'll see that the shadow becomes more recognizable as the same shape as the letters of the base title. You can also do things like rotate the shadow letters as well. And now note that because we're working in a 3D title, that we have the X-axis, the Y-axis, and the Z-axis. So we're able to manipulate things in 3D space. The final output image is 2D. But trust me, it is a 3D title, and you'll see that more when we're actually working on the Fusion tab. So if you want to add a little bit of rotation to the drop shadow, you could increase the rotation there on any axis you want. So you can see that as we increase the Y rotation away from 0 degrees, the drop shadow text stops facing the camera as much. And if we had it at 90 degrees, we basically wouldn't be able to see it at all because it would be perpendicular to the camera. We can also do X rotation if we want to flip it across like this horizontal line that you can imagine there, making it flip upside down if we so desire. And then Z rotation if we want to rotate it in a way where it's still facing the camera, but can be flipped upside down as well. And you can combine those rotations. You can also animate them with keyframe properties if you want to get a little bit complicated there. And so you can get quite fun with that. So another default shading element you may want to use and manipulate a little bit could be a red outline. So if you go to shading element 2 there and you check it to enable it, note that you can have multiple shading elements at the same time. You can see that it outlines the text in red. We can come down, select a color for that if we wanted it to be a black outline like before, and then we can manipulate the other settings as desired. You can also go to 5 and beyond, where they have blank elements, enable them, and then customize them to your likings. So you could have something like a shading element of a border fill, which would be a box in the background that goes along with the title. Round the corners of that, and you can see that it's creating the box for each character. So you could change the level to do line or text instead, which would mean one box for the entire text block, or one box for each line, or one box for each word or character, whatever level you want to set that up for. Select a color like before, and then alpha and opacity are basically the same thing. So you could lower the opacity down if you want that box to only partially hide the background. So likewise, with these settings, you can also manipulate the base title as well, of course. So if you go over to the third tab here, transform, you can manipulate the characters transform, the words transform, and the lines transform individually. So if you want to have a spin effect where you rotate the characters individually, then you would set this to characters. You would go down to rotation, and you would start adjusting the rotation, which you can keyframe, of course, if you want to animate it over time. However, you can also do an entire word by changing it to transform words, and then when you rotate that, you can see that it's doing it on a word-by-word basis. And to prove that, let's actually add in a couple words here. So let's call this city tour here. Go back to the transform for words and rotate it, and you see that it's rotating as a word-by-word basis there. And if we change the transform that we're editing to lines, then it's going to rotate each line individually. And you can have multiple lines as well. So if I duplicate city tour and I put it there, and we added in something like some Z rotation, you can see that each line is rotating around its own anchor point. So let's add some rotation in for the line. I think I'll rotate it on the Z axis so it can look a little bit cool. So let's keep the rotation with some rotation on the Z axis here, so that it's slanted a little bit. I think that could be fun. So to the left of the Transform tab, you have the Layout tab. So here you can organize how you want the text of your title to be organized. So by default, all of the text is positioning itself anchored to a certain point on your screen. So this would by default be right in the middle, and you can adjust where that point is by changing its position. And you can change where that center point should be, where everything else rotates in reference to. By adjusting the center values. So I could make that go up and to the left. By changing the center X and Y positions, you can also, of course, since it's 3D, you can also push the center Z value back so that it's further away from the camera, or decrease it to make it closer to the camera. But usually you can set that as its default values. Now this would be for a point layout, which means that everything is positioned referenced to a single point. In addition to point layout, you also have frame layout, which instead of having a single point in your title where everything's anchored around, you would actually have a frame box which the title will kind of try to fit inside. And we can see this much easier if we go over to the Fusion tab, because here it will actually draw it onto the screen for us. And when we're working in the Fusion tab, we'll often get these gizmos that we can actually manipulate the settings, such as increasing the height by dragging on the top border, or changing the position of our anchoring frame. Now you'll notice that as I change the position, that the title doesn't perfectly follow the frame or the point if we did this with point mode. And that's because there's a setting down here called perspective. So we can kind of think of it as the frame or the point is like a camera looking at the title, and based on how the frame is positioned relative to the title, it'll manipulate the appearance of the title on the background a little bit. Now, if you want the title to follow the frame or the point perfectly, rather than having that perspective applied to it, then you can take the perspective value and you can drop it down to 0. And now you can see that it will just follow the frame around perfectly rather than having any perspective applied to it. So the main purpose of these settings here, controlling the height and width and center position of the frame, or likewise the similar settings for the point, is controlling the anchoring of your text. So if I was to go over to the text tab, you can see that there is vertical anchoring and horizontal anchoring. So those anchor positions are going to be based relative to the boundaries of your box or the position of your point if you're in point mode. So if I anchor left, it's going to take the title and anchor it to the left. Now, because there's perspective added to our text currently, it's not going to actually appear right on the left. That's part of the perspective effect. So if we actually wanted it to be right on the left, we could disable the perspective, drop that down to 0, and now you can see that it's right over there on the left. We could also likewise right anchor it, but as we adjust the width and height of the box, you can see how that will dramatically change where the title goes. So likewise with the vertical anchoring, we can position it at the bottom, position the text at the top, or have it centered always. Then in point mode, it's kind of the same thing, except that everything is referencing this single point. So if we want the title to be on top of this point always, then we could go to the text mode and position it on top with the bottom vertical anchor, which means that the title is going to be anchored above the bottom there. But keep in mind that with the rotation we added in earlier, that due to the rotation, parts of it may actually appear below that anchor, but the base anchor point is still set to be at the bottom of the title. Okay, now the other two layout modes are considerably different. So in circle layout, you actually have the text going around the center point in a circle fashion. So you can see that the text now is curving around the center point. We could lower the size down dramatically if we want to bring it in closer. You can imagine that there's like an invisible circle here and that all the text is writing on the outside of that. Now you can see that if you add too much text for the circle, that it will actually spiral in order to fit all the text onto the screen. So we could increase the width of the circle in order to make it look more like a circle again. There's also these other ways of making everything fit on the screen, such as adjust horizontal size to fit or adjust size to fit, which will look a little different, but may give you the results that you're looking for. I'll just leave it as adjust spacing to fit for right now. So I got rid of some of the extra text, and I think for this to look right, you're actually going to want to change the vertical anchor back to center there. So I'm going to keep that center for vertical anchor and horizontal anchor there. And you can play around with this a lot more if you do want to do that kind of circle text effect, but I'm going to move on for now to path. So with path, you're actually having the text right on top of a path, and you do want to be in fusion mode in order to edit this. You can see that you're given a cursor in order to create Bezier curve paths for your text to appear on. So I can left click here, and you see that apparently there was already one point, so it creates another point down here, and the direction of the text is going to follow that. So I'm going to take this point and make it appear to the right so that the text is actually upright. With any of these points that you create along a path, you'll be given these Bezier curve handles. So if you want it to have a curve rather than be a straight line, you can drag these up and manipulate how your text is going to appear on the screen. You're given a bunch of tools up at the top. So if you want to add in extra points, you can do click append. So by doing that, we create another point there, which we can manipulate, change the position of, adjust the Bezier curve handle if we want it to curve. Whenever you have 2 points to the sides of a point, that middle point is going to have 2 curves now. So you can manipulate the curves on either side of a line. And you can use tools like the smooth button up here. If your curves ever look really wonky there, you can have it smooth out by clicking on the smooth button, which will kind of automatically make your curves a little bit nicer. Then you can continue adjusting them. You kind of get the idea. Your text is going to follow the path. One important setting for this is going to be position on path. So you can see that right now it's kind of centered there because the position on path is set to 0.5. But if you want it to start at the start of your path, then take the position on path and shift that over to the left. So that could be something like 0 as your value. Now note that it's not actually starting at the point, but that it's now centered at that first point. If we want it to start at the point, then we would want to go over to the title and take the anchor for horizontal anchor and left align that. So now it's going to start at that left point. Vertically, it's still centered though, so we could make that vertical align bottom. And then by doing that, it's going to make the vertical anchor the bottom point there. Now note that it's not following the path perfectly still because we do have that rotation from before over on the transform tab. So if we go take that rotation and we set it to 0, it'll actually follow the path now. So that's probably what you're going to be looking for if you're using the path layout. Main thing to note here is that if you animate too many settings, it may get kind of hard to keep track of how everything is affecting everything else. So generally start with your big changes first and then make your micro changes like adding a slight rotation to things later on so that you don't lose track of everything you're doing with your effect. So I think because it's still a little small here, I might increase the size of this path. I might also change the vertical positioning here, so I'll do it using the handles here. It's kind of a more visual way to see it rather than just changing numbers in the inspector. And we could kind of leave it there. Maybe we add a little bit more text to the title so that we can see that curve and its effect. And if we go over to the Edit tab, we'd be able to see how that title appears on the screen with that Path Tool effect. So that covers most of the differences between what you can do with the Text Plus element and the classic text titles. Now these Text Plus tools are also going to exist on any of the Fusion titles that you see default in DaVinci Resolve. What the pre-made Fusion titles do is combine these Text Plus settings with other 3D nodes, such as adding shapes to the background, shadows, lighting, pre-generated animations such as rotations around the screen or fade in. And they already have a default setup for you, so that you can basically just change the title of your text, maybe the font and the size of the elements, and just go with that without actually having to put too much more effort in. So if you're looking for a quick solution, then using one of the titles from Fusion Titles is going to be really handy. Of course, you can also take any of these Fusion titles, use it as a base, go over to the Fusion tab, and then edit it some more. So let's show some of the Fusion title default examples, and then we'll actually create one from scratch. So let's take the default Fusion titles, demonstrate a few, and then maybe I can show you guys how you can add in an extra node to one of them for a little bit of customization. And then later we'll create one or two titles from scratch. So I'm just going to take this Text Plus title and move that over to the side once again. And now we'll take one of the Fusion titles and drag it onto the screen by default. I would recommend that you just kind of try all of these out and see which ones you like the most. So you should just drag some of these onto the timeline and see how it might look for your video. So you can see with this title, we have a background, a bunch of text elements. And when we have these 3D titles put into the timeline, we actually get different controls for each of the elements that belong to that title. So not everything is going to be a Text Plus element in the setup for the Fusion nodes. But if you want to see exactly what's going on behind the scenes, just take your title and go over to the Fusion tab, and everything will generally be grouped together in a node group for the 3D title. So you can double click that. You can see everything that goes into it, and that it can get quite complicated. So that's kind of why I would recommend that as someone new to DaVinci Resolve, you probably stay a little bit away from customizing your own 3D titles, but I know that's what you guys want to learn in the video, so we're going to try to be covering that. So for this particular title, which everything is inside of the group, you can see that there's 5 3D text elements, which have the same settings that we were just talking about and those standard text pluses that you can drop onto the timeline. So an immense amount of stuff to customize. Those all merge together with this merge 3D element, and that's just to group things together so that if you need to apply something to everything in a group, then you merge it first. We have a spotlight to add some lighting to the title and elements in there. 3D camera, which provides us the viewing angle of the title's animation. Also a second light in the form of a point light. A 3D renderer to take all of these 3D elements and actually make them into a 2D image. And then after all of those titles are rendered, you have a combination of color gradient, a background, and a fast noise. And I believe those 3 are for generating this kind of cloudy effect you have in the background, which is animated a bit over time. So a pretty complicated effect, but you could come in here and edit any of the settings you want. You could also remove the parts you don't like. So anyway, anytime you want to see one of those default titles and you want to kind of get an idea of what's going on behind the scene or to manipulate it, you can come into the group, remove the elements you don't like, and add in extra nodes if you want to add something new to the effect. Usually, you don't need to worry about all of these nodes in the background when you're using a default effect, because on the Edit tab, you can see that most of the controls that the effect creator decided should be editable have already been exposed here. So if you wanted to put something into the first text, such as a title, you can expand the first text in the inspector and edit that, change the color, change the size, the font, the text in the title, whatever you need to. You can see that they've also exposed light controls. So if you need to change the light color or to raise or lower the intensity, or basically how powerful the lighting effect is, you can do that here. Background atmospheric controls, if you wanted to say take the clouds in the background and make them a little bit more visible, less blurry, you can increase the noise detail there, and you can kind of see it adds a little bit of clarity. You can kind of see where the noise is taking effect there. Or you could lower the noise detail and it becomes much blurrier. Also at the bottom you can see that there's a toggle here for motion blur. So if you play back your title without motion blur, you can see that while it's moving, it's always very clear. But if you toggle on motion blur, then as a object, in this case the 3D text, moves across the screen, it's going to blur itself out a little bit, making it blurrier by intent. So you have access to all of these controls for each of these Fusion titles that DaVinci Resolve provides out of the box. So honestly, you can get a lot done really easily and really fast if you just stick to the default Fusion titles. Let's go through a few other examples here before we actually talk about customizing our own. Okay, so let's go ahead and add another default Fusion title onto the timeline. So here we have a much simpler one, title horizontal line reveal. Obviously, the titles are going to try to reflect what actually the effect does. In this case, you have a line across the middle of the screen, and then the titles appear above and below. So you can see that there's an upper text control and a lower text control. So because as you can see here, the background is very bright, and that makes it hard to read the text. We can actually add in a generated color of black in between the title layer and the main video layer in order to make the title a little bit more visible. Of course, you could also add it in as a Fusion node. So we'll actually do it both ways, because so if you want to generate a color outside of Fusion nodes, then we can take the title, move it to video track 3, go into the effects library of generators, solid color, drop it down here, and that's going to by default make a black box that fits the entire screen. Now, by doing that, it's going to completely block the lower layers, the main video. So we want to reduce the opacity of the solid color layer. So the opacity setting here in the inspector can be dropped down as low as you want it. So if you set it to 50% opacity, that means 50% transparency. And what this will do when you have a partially transparent black box is just darken the lower layers, which makes it much easier to see your title. And with this solid generated black box, you can quickly animate it with a fade in and a fade out by clicking on these little notches in the top right and top left hand corner, which exist for all video clips in DaVinci Resolve. So I'll drag this over to the left here to create a fade out, and I'll drag it in on the left to create a fade in. And now if we play this back from frame 0, you can see that the black box fades in and then fades out as the title completes. Because your 3D Fusion titles need to be rendered, you may actually have to hit play on it a few times to see it play back properly in real time. But if you get any slowdown with the effect, don't worry, you don't have to have it perfectly pre-rendered. When you do deliver your project, it will play back at the proper speed. This is just how effects tend to have a slow pre-rendering in video editing programs. That's how you can do it with the solid color generator. So let's show you guys how to do it with the Fusion nodes, which is one of the main things about this video. So let's do it with Fusion nodes now. So with the title selected, I'm going to go into the Fusion tab here, and we could open up this title group if we desired, but because this is kind of like a outside effect, I think what we might actually want to do is have this be separate from this title here for now. So I'll close the group, and we'll merge a black background with this title group in order to generate the final title effect. So I'm going to right click here and do Add Tool, and we'll go down to Generator and Background. So this should look very similar to just doing the solid color generator in the Edit tab. And then I'll right click, do Add Tool, and under Composite we'll add in a merge element. So when you use a merge node, it's important to note the ordering. So whatever goes into this orange spot here is going to be the background layer, or whatever is on the lowest level of this node output. And then whatever comes after that, such as the green, as the foreground element, is going to show on top of that. So we want the background to be the actual background when we do our merged output. So the background should go into this first. So with any node, you can connect it to another node by clicking on these little points that you see coming out of it. and drag that into another node. So this background node now becomes the background of the merged node. We can disconnect this connection for the title group to the media out by clicking on the right end of it. And then we can feed the group into the merge now. And now that these two are merged together, we feed this to the media output. And you can see the media output previewing in the box up here. You know which one is previewing because below the node, you'll have these little boxes showing the left output or the right view. So we could also have it appear on the left view over here. You can have 2 preview windows at one time, or you can reverse it down to 1 if you are concerned about space. But in any case, our background is now going into the final output, as you see based on our node setup. And the nice thing about having the group is that we don't actually need to care about any of the complexity that exists inside of this group. We just need to be concerned with the final output of that group. And that makes the rest of this node setup pretty simple. So in very complicated node setups, grouping things will make your life easier and more manageable. So just like before, we probably don't want 100% alpha or no transparency at all, because otherwise we can't see anything underneath it. So we can take the alpha, which is the same as opacity, and set that to 0.5 for 50%. And once you have that, you can see the checkered background, which is a representation of how much alpha you have. If you have alpha or transparency, you should be able to at least partially see the checkered background. Now, if we go over to the Edit tab, we can see that the title is updated with that black background. So once you've made some changes to a Fusion title or created one for yourself, you may want to export it. So there's really 2 ways you can go about doing it. One way is to create a macro, and a macro allows you to customize which settings are going to be editable. And you can take that macro settings file and give it to someone who can install it on their computer so they can just drag and drop the new Fusion title into their timeline in the same way that we did before. So if you install it to the right titles folder, they'll show up here in the list. The second way is to export a node group as a settings file. As far as I've been able to figure out, with setting files, you can't actually expose settings over here. So with settings files, they would pretty much load in the node group and everything would be editable, which you may prefer, but I haven't been able to find a way yet where you can manually expose the nodes to appear here as controls where you can edit it in the edit mode inspector. So anyway, if you want to create a macro where you can actually push some of these controls to be editable in the inspector, but then the person using the macro won't be able to edit these nodes directly, you can do that by selecting all of your nodes, right-clicking, going to Macro, Create Macro, and then you'll get this box for the macro editor where you give it a name. So you could call it like Custom Title 1 or something like that. And then you simply expand the different nodes that you see down here below. So for instance, you can go to the background effect and then you check any box for export where you want that setting to be editable in the future. So for instance, you could come down here and check everything in color if you want to make sure that the background color should be editable and all the settings inside of that part of the node. So you just repeat that for all the settings you want to allow someone in the future to be able to edit. And once you've done that, you hit close. You hit yes to save changes to macro tool. And then you can save that on your computer. So it will give you this default folder in your app data. But if you want to export this as a title that will show up in the effects library, then you're actually going to want to save the settings file into the DaVinci Resolve install folder. Go into Fusion, Templates, Edit, and then Titles. And you'll see all of the titles that are installed to DaVinci Resolve here. So we can select the path here, copy it, and in the save box, I'm going to paste that in. So we just need to give it the name here for the macro. So custom title 1.setting. So if we were to hit save there, you may run into this issue of not having administrative permission. So you might need to restart DaVinci Resolve ran as an administrator, or you could save this to the desktop and move it later on. Anyway, once you're able to move it into that folder, then your new macro titles should show up in the edit mode effects library. So if we go over here, I already did that in advance. So for instance, I can take this test title, drag it into the timeline. So if I click on it, we can see that in the inspector that the Fusion macro settings are actually enabled here. So we can customize the type of color, the red, green, blue values, and the alpha. So obviously, if you want to allow people to customize things like the top text or the bottom text, then you'll need to expose those settings in the macro, and that can be a little bit of a pain. So the other option is to export it as a settings file directly rather than a macro. So if we click on the horizontal line reveal title that we were working with, go back to the Fusion tab, and then we select all of the nodes, we can export it as a standard settings file by right-clicking, going to Settings, Save As, and then you would just save that somewhere on the computer. So you could call this title horizontal line reveal modified. And then just like before, if you want to be able to use it as a title, you put that into the Fusion Templates Edit Titles folder and save that in here. So likewise, I created the custom setting title in advance as well. So we can drag that onto the timeline. If we click on it, you can see that the same controls that were exposed in the original title still exist there. And if we take this and go over to the Fusion tab, you'll be able to see that the nodes are exactly how they were in the original setup. Now, when I was exporting this, I made a mistake, which is that the title horizontal line reveal shouldn't be going to media out. It should actually be the merge. So I'd probably want to re-export that setting and override it if it was going to actually use it. But the advantage of doing it this way is that the nodes will be completely editable like it was in your original project. Now, there's also a secondary way to use a settings file, which is to drag it straight into any node editor. So you could create a blank Fusion composition if you wanted by going over to, I believe it's Effects, and then Fusion Composition. Drop that onto the timeline. So a Fusion composition is a blank canvas for you to be able to work from. So if we go over to the Fusion tab with Fusion composition selected, you'll see that only the media out exists here. So I can actually drag any settings file in here to add the nodes from the settings file straight into this Fusion composition. You could also drag in a settings file to a already default 3D title template. So anything that is a setup inside of the Fusion tab, you can add any settings file to. That would also work with macros, except that you can't go into the macro and edit it except for any setting that has already been exposed. So I could get rid of this extra media out and drag this merge to the media out there. And that would just be another way of using a settings file. So let's go ahead and create a completely from scratch title using a Fusion composition as the base, and then we'll add a bunch of nodes to make everything come together and show a couple ways you can customize it after you have that created. When we want to create a completely custom title from scratch, we could use a Fusion composition, which is just going to have a media out and then start building nodes into that for creating the title. But instead, what I'm going to do is we're going to take our original base clip and then go over to the Fusion tab. With the base clip here, if we start making changes and merge everything together, then we're going to have the media in here as a background node by default. So what we can do is build the title inside of this Fusion tab, and then later export everything except for the media in as a settings file, which can be pulled into anyone's DaVinci Resolve editor. But having the media in to work with on this tab so we can see it, basically previewing it before we go back to the edit tab, is going to help our workflow a little bit. So when we're ready to get started on making our custom title, we can either add in a text plus element or a 3D text. So a 3D text is going to have to be rendered, so it's going to need a 3D renderer before you merge it with other nodes such as the media in, before you feed into the media out. Text plus is going to have more or less the same settings, except I don't think it can actually be a 3D object. But the advantage may be that a text plus element would render faster, not needing to exist in 3D space before being rendered out to a 2D image. So you can select whichever one you want. We'll go ahead and do some 3D text here. We'll also include 3D shapes later on to make things a little interesting. So with this text 3D element, I'm going to add a merge 3D node. Note that I have the text 3D selected, so click on merge, and then it will automatically link the two nodes. And then we can add a 3D renderer after the merge to convert everything that comes before it into a 2D image. And with that, we can right-click and do Add Tool, and then go to Composite and Merge to create a merge node for the media in and the 3D renderer. So I'm going to take the media in and put it to the merge node as the background. That is the yellow connection here. And then anything we want to show on top of that, like the 3D text title, will go as the foreground, which is the green connector. So once we have all of this merged together, we feed it to the media out, and then that will generate the final image of this video clip. So next I'm going to add some text to the 3D text node. So if we go in here and we say title, then you should see something appear on the screen. You can also preview the 3D text node by clicking on the circle boxes that will appear below any node. So if I click on the left circle toggle, then you'll see the title appear in 3D space here. So now this left preview window is previewing specifically the text 3D node, and the right preview window is previewing media out, which is the final result. So you can have two preview windows at once, which allows you to see how things look at different stages along this node process. So I might decide that this title is too big, so I can lower the size down to something a little bit more manageable, like 0.5, and leave it alone. So next we might decide that we want an additional text 3D for a subtitle. So I think if we have the Merge 3D node selected and we click on Text 3D, it will automatically link the new Text 3D to the Merge node. So now we have two titles feeding into one Merge 3D node, which goes to the renderer, which goes to the final 2D merge and the media out. So with this, I can say Subtitle, which is clearly way too big, and we'll need to decrease the size using the controls in the inspector. So lowering it down to something like 0.33 or 0.36 is going to be just fine. You may want to adjust the position of these titles, and we could see both of them at once if we showed the Merge 3D as the preview. So I'll add that to the left view. And now we can see both of the titles in 3D space there. So you can left click on either of the titles to select them. Note that when you do, the node selection will reflect that. So you could also select it in the nodes first as well. I'll take the subtitle and I'll lower that down by clicking on the position gizmo. And I'll take the top title and I'll increase the position of that by clicking on the green Y position gizmo. So now we can just kind of position that where it makes sense for our video clip. So next we could add in a 3D shape to be rendered as part of this title sequence. So if I click on Merge 3D and I click on Shape 3D, that will create a new shape that we can use. Now, a plane is going to be pretty terrible. So I might want to change that to something more like a torus, which is actually a donut shape. If you zoom out in the Merge 3D, you can kind of see that. It's a very thick donut at this point in time. So I might want to rotate that so that the middle whole part is actually facing the camera. So if I go over to the transform settings of the Shape 3D, I can rotate the torus, and I think we want the x-axis here, making that something like 90 degrees there. And now over on the controls tab, we can make it a lot smaller. So if we take the radius and shrink that, it'll make it a smaller torus. And then we can drop the section value to make it look a lot more like a hollowed out circle. So if we set that to something like 0.039, now we get something that resembles a circle shape for our title. And then next we can go over to the material tab if we want to set a color for the shape. So we can make it anything we want. Something like a darker color, like a deep blue or deep red, would help keep the focus on the title and the subtitle itself. So we could leave that there. So one fun effect we could use on the title and subtitle for it to appear onto the screen would be right on and right off. So if you have one of these 3D text titles selected, you'll notice that there's a setting in the first tab for right on, and you can keyframe it. So what will happen is if I pull the end of the right on backwards, it will start making letters disappear in the ratio of the ends. So if it's at 0.2, that means that the other 80% of that title beyond the end point for this right is going to hide. So you can animate this setting over time in order to make the letters appear. So below the preview windows, you can see the timeline for the clip that we are working on, which could also be a fusion composition. And we can go to a frame where we want to keyframe. If I select in the timeline 50 frames, you'll see that appear here. And we can check the keyframe diamond for right on in order to have it be fully faded in for the right on effect at that point in time. And then we go back to frame 0 and we decrease the right on at the end value to 0. And now between those two frames, the right on effect is going to be appearing. So if I go to frame 0 now and hit the play button for the fusion title, the text characters will appear. So now if I go to frame 0 and hit the play button, those text characters will appear over 50 frames. Now that might be too fast for you, it might be too slow. As long as you later export this custom title as a settings file, or you export it as a macro where the Righton values would be able to be customized. Then other people will be able to change it so that they can get the values they want for their project in the future. So as long as we get the base how we like it, that should be good enough for right now. Now we might also want to do that with the top title. So for instance, I can type in frame 50 here in the frame counter. And so this time maybe we take the top and we have it right on in the reverse direction. So at 50 frames, I'm going to keyframe it. And then at the beginning, instead of moving the end to the start, I'm going to move the start to the end, which will automatically create a keyframe there. So when we hit play, it seems like the Righton effect for the top is going a little bit slower. And I think that's just based on how the Righton effect determines at what point a ladder should appear or when it shouldn't. We may need to play around with those settings a little bit if we want to make them appear at the screen at the same time. One easy fix we could do would just be to move the keyframes of the bottom so that it appears a little bit later. So we could take the keyframe value at frame 50 and move that to frame 60. So I'll go here, frame 60, I'll keyframe, I'll hit the back button to jump to frame 50 and unkeyframe it. And then I'll also move the 0 keyframe of 0, 0 Righton values to frame 10. And I'll make that 0 there as well. I'll hit the back button and remove it at frame 0. So now the keyframes are 10 and 60. You can see the little indicator below the preview window for where a setting is keyframed. And now if we hit play, it should match up a little bit closer. So that's pretty close. We could just take a second and make it go 5 frames more. So why not? And remove the old keyframes and then hit play one more time. So with that, it seems to be a little bit more synchronized. We could always spend a little more time on that if we want. I think what I'll also do here is lower the subtitle a little bit so that the title and the subtitle are more equally distanced from the center of the screen there. Next, we could take the torus shape and have it rotate over time. But I'm going to assume that when you pull in this template, you always want the torus to be rotating. So I'm actually going to just set the keyframes at 0 and something like 300 so that depending if someone stretches the title to be 150 frames to 300, it's still going to animate over that time. And I'm just going to have the torus have a rotation. So on the transform tab at frame 0 for the torus, we can keyframe the Z rotation, which is going to be the rotation facing the camera. And then at 300, we can go put a value for that Z rotation. So this can be increments of 360 degrees if we want it to be a full spin or multiple full spins. So I might do something like 720. We could also take that 720 and do ×2 right inside of the input box for the rotation to double it to 1440 degrees, which means 4 rotations over 300 frames. So you can do math in these input boxes, which is kind of nice. So now if we go back to the start here and we hit play, the torus should animate a little bit over time. Now, it's kind of janky there, probably because the torus doesn't really have as many segments as we would like, or maybe we actually want to decrease the amount of segments. So if we hit stop, we can go over to the control section and set the number of divisions. So I might drop that to something like 8 if I want to make the rotation a little more obvious. So now if we play it back again from frame 0, it's got a little bit more of an interesting shape. So now if we go to frame 0 and we let it play back, we're going to have that rotation occur over the 300 frames. And it's a lot more obvious when it looks less like a circle and more like an octagon. Note that when it does get to frame 300, it's going to stop by default there. So we can have almost any property animate during this title. So if I want the shape to start out faded out, I can go to frame 0 and set the alpha to 0 to make it completely transparent, which should be invisible, and then go to something like frame 15 or so, and then set the alpha to 1, which means over those 15 frames, we're going to go from completely transparent to visible. So if we hit play here, we'll see it fading in. The reason why you can still see it there, even though the diffuse color is set to 0 there, is that there's also the specular color. So we can take almost any property that exists within these nodes and animate it for our title. So for instance, if we want this octagon to appear invisible at the start, then we want to set the opacity at frame 0 to something like 0. So keyframe it and then drag the opacity to 0. And then just type in the frame over here in the frame selector where you want the opacity to be faded in. So I can make that 1.0 opacity now, which will be fully visible. And now we go to frame 0 and hit play. And now the octagon is going to fade in during those first 15 frames. Okay, so another good thing to know about in DaVinci Resolve, for any of these 3D objects, you can actually turn on lighting for them. So if you want objects to have to be lit by a light rather than always being fully visible, what you can do is you can go to the 3D renderer here, and then toggle lighting and actually shadows as well. If you had something like a plane in 3D down below, you could have your 3D objects cast a shadow onto those other objects. But for now, we're just going to enable lighting here, which will turn the colors of everything black because it has no lighting. So in order to bring back the color, we're going to need to add in some lights. So you can see a spotlight as a default option on the toolbar. You can also right-click, add tool, go to 3D and light, and there's three other options. Ambient lights, which are going to basically light up the entire scene. Directional light, which is kind of like a sun, where it will push light in a direction, but equally across everything in the entire scene. Point lights, which will have light emitting from a point in 3D space, and then spotlight, which has a point where the light exists in, and then that light is angled towards some area in your 3D scene, much like a flashlight. So a point light would end up being more like a lamp that just happens to exist in your 3D scene. So we'll start with an ambient light here. And we'll add it to the merge 3D. So when we do that, you should see a little bit of color come back to all of your 3D objects. If you want the ambient light to bring back more of it, then just increase the intensity. And then that can end up being the base level for the lighting in your scene. So next, you could add in something like a spotlight. So let's click on the toolbar option for that and add it to the merge 3D. So with all of these objects that exist in the merge 3D, if your merge 3D is still the preview window, you should be able to see them over here in that Merge 3D preview. If you want to rotate around, hold Alt down while holding the middle mouse wheel, and you can drag that to see everything inside of your scene, and that can give you a different perspective on what's actually occurring there. So you can see that the spotlight is at the 0x, 0y, 0z origin, but we actually need it to aim towards these objects if we want to light up the front of it, which will be seen in the video. So in order for the spotlight to light up our object, we're going to need to move it on the z-axis until it can light up everything inside of our scene. So you see at this distance, it's actually lighting up the objects there, and you can see a different type of lighting, the specular lighting, on that 3D torso. So you have the diffuse color, which is the base color of the object more or less, and then the specular color will show up at the areas where the light rays are hitting it directly. So in this case, the lines here that you're actually seeing is the specular lighting, the white lines there, which are the most outward sticking point of the 3D object. Think of a donut, so it would be the closest to the spotlight. And then those other outer areas, the ones that are kind of blue, that's showing mostly diffuse lighting right there. So one cool, easy effect we could do here is to make the spotlight's position animate over, say, the first 20, 30 frames. So I'm going to hit Control-Z to reset the position to the 000 initially. I'm going to go to the transform for the spotlight, and I'm going to keyframe the Z translation, which is the position. So next I'm going to click on frame 30 or so, and then I'm going to take the spotlight once again and pull it out to the position I want it to move to at the end, which is going to basically have the light hit all areas of our 3D scene, including the outer torso. You can actually see a red line now for the path that it's going to travel, this light, for those 30 frames. And if I go to frame 0 and hit play, we can see the spotlight moving its position during those frames for the 3D scene. So once again, going back to frame 0, it's at position 000, and then over 30 seconds, then the Z translation moves 2 units in the 3D space, and it goes from not lighting up the scene at all to lighting up everything. Now, one more thing, you may actually want to change the specular lighting of the 3D torso as well. So we can click on the 3D shape there, click on specular color, and then change that to a different value. So whatever color we want it to show at those areas where the light rays hit it directly, we can customize that. So we may want it to be something like a lighter blue. So given that the text 3Ds are actually 3D objects as well, we can take these 3D texts and extrude them outwards to make them a 3D object, kind of like a building block. So if you click on one of the text 3D elements and you go to the text control on the left, extrusion will be an option there. And you can take the extrusion depth and increase that which you'll see that the text now becomes a 3D representation of those text characters. We can also do that for the subtitle as well if we want. So I'm going to go over to the text tab, extrusion, give it an extrusion depth. You can also see in the final media out that blockiness is going to show a little bit. It would show a lot more if you actually angle the text. So if I was to say go to the transform tab and add some rotation, you would be able to see the 3D effect a lot more there. And just like with the 3D torus, you can actually set a base color and also a specular color. So the base color here is going to be the diffuse color, that's the main one, and then the specular color will be the color that shows where the light rays are hitting it more or less directly. So in this case, once we're past frame 30, you can kind of imagine that the light ray is going straight in the center here, and that's why you get more specular color in those areas of the subtitle that are actually closer to that center. Alternatively, you can just leave both as a basic white and keep it simple. I think that's plenty fine for most cases. If you keep playing around with 3D titles in DaVinci Resolve, you may also find in the Add Tools menu other useful nodes. So you can come in here and play around with the other 3D nodes. If you need to add in a material to a 3D object, make your titles look metallic in nature, which can change how light will reflect off of them. You can apply a gradient texture node if you want to apply a gradient as the color import for a node. And you also have access to all of the Resolve effects that you can apply to base video clips. So if you added another merge node in here, you could add in something like a Gaussian blur, which, depending on what step you do the merge to, could apply to the base original clip, or it could apply to the effect that you generate from your 3D renderer. The main thing I'm trying to illustrate here is that using nodes on the Fusion tab, there's a lot you can actually create inside of DaVinci Resolve 16 that includes but isn't limited to just simple title effects. But hopefully this example of creating a title in DaVinci Resolve gives you some ideas about what you can create in your own 3D titles. I'll include the settings file exactly as it shows in this video if you want to use this as a template or to look at it to learn from. So once again, if you want to install a title and you want it to show up whenever you restart DaVinci Resolve, make sure you put it in your Program Files, Blackmagic Design, DaVinci Resolve, Fusion, Templates, Edit, Titles directory, or the equivalent on Mac or Linux.